Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Bipartisan Policy Center. We are pleased to be hosting this prestigious and evidence-based conversation, which most of us don't have a lot of opportunities to experience these days. And so I just want to take a few minutes to set the stage and then welcome the administrator to start us off. You can't really start an energy discussion without somehow acknowledging the dynamic nature of the energy transition. And mostly that's when people kind of look backwards over the last 10 years. And that has certainly been pretty significantly disruptive. And at the same time, it will be absolutely dwarfed by the transition that needs to happen over the next 30 years, if in fact the United States is going to meet the level of decarbonization that the scientific community generally suggests. So I think the good news is, we got a little bounce in our step, but we are going to have to make remarkable strides. And I think this AEO gives us kind of the baseline against which we can have that conversation. The good news is that among all the different issues that we work on here at the Bipartisan Policy Center, there's only one that is becoming more constructive and bipartisan every week, and that's energy and climate. Now, that may be soaring over a very low bar, but we have now, I think, shifted in a really meaningful way from a pretty unproductive discussion over the existence of the problem to what will now become, I think, a very productive battle over the appropriate solutions. And those are all over the map, right? I think you all heard about the alliterative proposal for 1 trillion trees coming from the House Republican leadership, which I think the fact that the House Republican leadership is coming forth with a global scale suggestion is incredibly important. We have the suggestions of eliminating fossil fuels in the next 10 years, and then we have the energy and commerce proposal, which I think is the most serious effort to try to put that kind of path forward. And so evidence now matters. We have a quaint affinity for evidence here at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and I think there's no more important document in the energy discussion than the Annual Energy Outlook. We talk about facts. I think it's worth recognizing that the AEO represents rigorously developed conclusions transparently presented, which is about as close as you can get to facts in a fair democracy. And so to lead us off, we are delighted to have Administrator Capuano with us. The Administrator and I had the pleasure of serving together for, seemed like a decade, but I think it was about 18 months on the National Petroleum Council's infrastructure study. And that was a nice opportunity to continue to think about the importance of sustaining the basic economic integrity of our energy system. The administrator was appointed to EIA in 2018. Prior to this government service, she's had a really remarkably broad career focused on the commercialization of innovative technology, having worked at Marathon Oil, Selectron Flextronics, which is my favorite named company, Advanced Energy Industries, Honeywell, Allied Signal, and IBM. Lynn is also a lifetime member of the National Academy of Sciences, which strikes me as a great honor and frightening obligation. So we thank you for that. She's going to give us an overview of the AEO for 25 or 30 minutes. We'll then have about 20 minutes for audience interaction, and then we're going to have a panel with some experts to dig a little deeper, and then obviously some more Q&A. So with that, thank you for coming, and Madam Administrator.
So thank you, Jason, and thank you, the Bipartisan Policy Center, for hosting the public release of the U.S. Energy Information Administration's Annual Energy Outlook 2020 and putting together a panel to discuss the implications. And welcome everyone to today's release. The full AEO document, which includes these presentation graphs as well as the full data tables, will be available for download on the EIA website at the conclusion of this briefing, and the recording of this webcast will be made available by both the BPC and the EIA on both our sites. So first I'd like to take a moment to introduce, I see I already made the, Steve Nally, who is the EIA's Deputy Administrator. Steve, will you please stand so everybody can see. And Angelina LaRose, the EIA's Assistant Administrator for the Office of Energy and Analysis. While the AEO includes data and work of the full EIA, Angelina's Office of Energy Analysis is responsible for leading and producing this AEO and other analysis products for EIA. The AEO 2020 is a modeled projection of the U.S. Energy Administration's the U.S. energy system from now until 2050, and is one of the two long-term energy projections published to fulfill EIA's Department of Energy Organization Act of 1977 requirement that the EIA administrator prepare annual reports on trends and projections for energy use and supply, independent of policy advocacy or administration review. This 2020 update to the AEO is another modeling year. There we go, is another modeling year that introduces changes in our perspective on energy in the United States. In 2018, the U.S. became the largest producer of oil and natural gas in the world. And in 2019, oil and oil products exports exceeded imports, and we became a net exporter on a monthly basis. Domestic production of U.S. renewable electricity is poised to overtake production using nuclear and coal within the decade. These milestones highlight the importance of modeling U.S. energy into the future, as well as the unique capability of EIA's natural energy modeling system to explore macroeconomic interactions within the U.S. energy system and between the energy system and the economy. NEM's integrative capability, plus the AEO reference case assumptions that current laws and regulations will generally remain unchanged to 2050, create an important baseline that allows you to consider the potential impact of technology investments or future policy actions. So if you or your organization find some of the projections discouraging, like those for renewables and emissions, remember that the AEO is a projection, not a prediction, and that contrasting the reference case baseline with the AEO side cases can help you evaluate what more or less needs to be done to achieve economic or policy goals. The AEO includes a reference case and 8 side cases with a range of input assumptions that can illustrate the uncertainty in making long-term energy projections. One of the most sensitive inputs is the real U.S. gross domestic product, because small changes in the economy can significantly affect energy consumption. The reference case assumes 1.9% GDP growth, while the high and low economic growth cases assume 2.4 and 1.4. World oil prices also have an effect on energy production and consumption in the U.S. The reference case assumes Brent oil prices reach $105 per barrel in 2050, while the high and low oil price cases assume $183 and $46. On the 5th bullet, I'd like to call your attention to a nomenclature change. We have renamed the oil and gas resource and technology cases. Starting this year, these will be called oil and gas supply cases. As before, the high supply case assumes more accessible resources and lower extraction costs when compared to the reference case, and the low case assumes fewer accessible resources and higher extraction costs. But of particular interest is our decision to introduce a new set, the high and low renewable cost cases. Past AEOs have shown that model projections are sensitive to changes in renewables' economic competitiveness, and we are in a period of dynamic regulatory change and significant investment in cost-reducing renewables technologies. We decided it would be helpful to provide a modeled perspective on the potential impact of increased investment to find technology breakthroughs or laws and regulations that provide more aggressive cost incentives. So while the reference case assumes technology cost reductions continue to follow historical trends, the AEO now includes a low renewables cost case that accelerates cost declines, ending at 40% below the costs of the reference case in 2050. Here are what I believe to be the 4 most significant highlights of our baseline reference case. First, the rate of U.S. energy consumption growth remains slower than GDP growth, so the energy intensity of the U.S. economy continues its historical decline. Second, electricity generation fuel mix continues to experience a rapid rate of change. Third, the U.S. continues to produce historically high levels of crude oil and natural gas, and the total U.S. energy-related carbon dioxide emissions fall, then resume modest growth in the 2030s. I'll discuss each one of these as supporting data, starting with the first. There we go. Total U.S. energy consumption is the product of population, per capita GDP, and energy intensity. The graph on the left shows the Census Bureau's projection that U.S. population will continue to grow. The next shows IHS Markit's projection that GDP per capita will continue to grow as U.S. economic growth outpaces population growth. The third shows energy intensity declining as the U.S. uses less energy to produce the same amount of economic activity. Combining these trends, the graph on the far right shows EIA's projection that total U.S. energy consumption remains relatively steady until it begins to increase slowly after 2030, as the U.S. economic growth eventually overcomes long-term trends of declining U.S. energy intensity within the economy. Meanwhile, the U.S. fuel mix is shifting as well, and the electric power generation is an important example. This shift has been strongly influenced by federal and state policies that help make renewables the fastest growing source of electricity generation in the U.S. In addition, continuing investment is resulting in cost declines that will make them economically competitive even beyond the expiration date of current policies and initiatives. And with slow load growth, increasing renewables electricity production puts pressure on U.S. coal-fired and nuclear electricity generation. They decline as less economically competitive generating plants continue to retire. This slide shows that, I'm not sure what I'm doing wrong, but eventually I'll get it. There we go. This slide shows that even in the high economic growth case, we expect U.S. electricity demand to grow slowly and remain close to historical lows through 2050. Our projections show the effect of energy efficiency appliances, LEDs, and other efforts to improve consumption efficiency are being offset by economic growth, the increased use of gadgets, the increased use of electrification to deliver energy, and demographic shifts toward regions needing more air conditioning. It is not me. There we go. But slow U.S. electricity demand growth also means the power markets do not need to add large amounts of new generating capacity. The graph on the left shows the dynamic environment of economic competition and market share displacement. We see that the decline in coal in black and nuclear in red slow in the mid-20s as inefficient plants retire and their contribution is taken over by more efficient and competitive plants. We see in blue that the relatively low gas prices support continued growth in natural gas, and renewables in green quickly overtake nuclear and coal to become the second most common source of generation. Renewables even overtake gas in the 2040s to become the leading source of electricity generation in the reference case. The graph on the right compares renewable technologies. Wind in green is poised to become the leading source of renewables generation as costs decrease. However, wind generation growth slows after the expiration of current production tax credits in the mid-20s, and solar power in yellow, which includes distributed rooftop solar, becomes the primary renewable generation technology in the U.S. around 2040, based upon the AEO assumptions about cost reductions under current policies and technology investments in the reference case. So let's keep our eye on the reference case on the left and compare it to the low-cost renewables case. Because the AEO 2020 projections illustrate economic competition between wind, solar, natural gas, coal, and nuclear, EIA has introduced a low renewables cost case graphed on the right, where renewables achieve overnight capital costs in 2050 that are 40% lower than those in the reference case. The result is acceleration of renewables growth shown in green, while natural gas in blue remains flat when compared to the reference case. EIA presents this case to provide a model comparison so you can see how lower prices affect the fuel mix, with the hope that this will be useful as you think about your policy and investment decisions. Since we expect there will be keen interest in understanding the low renewables cost case, the full set of charts are downloadable, and Angelina LaRose will describe some of the additional work EIA plans in this area in a few minutes. Now let's look at oil and natural gas projection. Recall that in our cases, total U.S. energy consumption growth remains relatively slow, while U.S. crude oil, natural gas, and natural gas plant liquids production continues to increase. Increasing production growth and slower consumption growth enable the U.S. to export significant volumes of oil and gas, but these results are sensitive to the assumptions, as we'll show in the next few slides. Here we see the slow growth in total U.S. energy consumption is reflected in our petroleum projections. The graph on the left shows that petroleum and other liquid fuels consumption in the reference case remain relatively steady at historical levels, ending about 4% lower in 2050 when compared to 2019, and that economic growth showed by the side cases in blue has more impact on consumption than the oil and gas supply. The oil and natural gas plant liquids production on the right shows that we project continued growth because of rising prices and falling production costs, and that U.S. crude oil production achieves an all-time high in the next decade. This is in addition to the U.S. already being the largest crude oil producer in the world and having produced approximately 12.3 million barrels per day of crude in 2019. Natural gas plant liquids also continue to grow and set production records of 4.9 million barrels per day in 2019. The impact in the size and ease of extracting resources are represented on the right by the brown and tan oil and gas supply cases. When U.S. petroleum product exceeds consumption, the resulting volumes are exported as shown in this graph. As we just saw, with strong production growth and fairly steady domestic consumption, the U.S. becomes an annual net exporter of petroleum and other liquids on a volumetric basis in 2020 and remains a net exporter through 2050 in the reference case. Looking more closely at the black line, U.S. total petroleum exports by volume will peak at about 3.8 million barrels per day early in the 30s before gradually declining as domestic consumption rises. The range of impact that results from varying oil and gas supply is shown in brown. Natural gas shows similar dynamics. Production growth slows to less than 1% per year after 2020 in the reference case. However, natural gas production exceeds consumption across all AEO cases. Looking at natural gas trade in more detail on the left, the U.S. remains a net exporter of gas from Canada through 2050, but imports from Canada in pink decrease while exports to Canada in red increase. Pipeline exports to Mexico in brown increase through 2030 and hold steady through 2050. The greatest increase in U.S. exports occurs in liquefied natural gas in black by waterborne trade, growing to 2030 as additional LNG export terminals are constructed. We also see on the right that the level of LNG exports varies significantly depending on the assumptions. The high oil price case assumptions in red show LNG exports growing to twice that of the reference case, while the unfavorable economics of the low oil and gas supply case in tan show that LNG export capacity could actually become idle toward 2050 under those assumptions. Now let's take a quick look at oil and gas price assumptions. World oil prices can vary widely as shown on the left. In the reference case, they grow slowly from current levels, rising a little over $100 per barrel by 2050. Prices vary more significantly in the oil price side cases, reflecting different assumptions about global price drivers as they explore variations in extraction technology and resource availability as applied in the United States. On the right, U.S. benchmark Henry Hub natural gas prices are below $4 in the reference case and range from a low of about $2.25 to a high of about $6.50 per million BTUs, depending on the input assumptions. We have now touched upon energy demand, electricity, and oil and gas across the reference and side cases. We've seen relatively low rates of demand growth. We've seen renewable generation growing at the expense of coal and nuclear. We've seen oil and gas production and exports growing. We can now look at the impact this energy sector activity has on carbon dioxide emissions. This graph shows that total U.S. energy carbon dioxide emissions in black fall and then resume modest growth in the 30s. Nevertheless, total CO2 emissions remain 4% below 2019 levels in 2050. Looking at the details, initially, U.S. CO2 emissions from energy use fall as fuel economy standards through the mid-20s reduce the transportation sector consumption of liquid fuels in blue. And the electric power sector in yellow increases renewables in the fuel mix as coal plants continue to retire. However, current regulations in the transportation sector do not require additional efficiency increases after 2027. Therefore, if no further policy actions take place, motor gasoline consumption will begin to rise, as will emissions. U.S. jet fuel consumption also continues to rise, up more than 30% by 2050 as air transportation growth outpaces outpaces increases in aircraft energy efficiency. Electric power emission in yellow level then grows slightly as decline from coal-fired generation is offset by increases from gas-fired generation. Industrial emissions in green grow the fastest as industry takes advantage of relatively low natural gas prices. And so, I can't believe we did this in 10 minutes. And so I would like to conclude my remarks and have Angelina LaRose come to the podium and discuss additional analyses that will be part of the AEO 2020. And I thank you for your interest, and I encourage you to download and examine the full document. I hope it provides helpful context for you to make decisions about energy use in the future. Come on up, Angelina.
All right. Good morning. So I'm going to be telling you a little bit about some additional analysis that is going to be coming out with the AEO 2020 in a series of issues and focus articles. For those of you familiar with the Annual Energy Outlook, EIA puts together these issues and focus articles, which are kind of a deeper dive into a specific issue, and they're typically released after the Annual Energy Outlook. So our first issues and focus article is going to be released today with the full suite of publication materials that come out with the AEO. And it's going to relate back to the two new cases that Linda mentioned, these high and low renewables cost cases. So it's going to take a deeper dive into looking at the assumptions behind those cases, how are higher and lower costs achieved in our assumptions, and what the effect that those have on our results. So that is coming out later this morning. We're also releasing an alternative policies, issues, and focus at the beginning of March. And so this is looking at certain policy areas. As Linda mentioned, our reference case as well as our core side cases are current laws and regulations. So what this alternative policies case does is look at varying key assumptions for certain policy type things. So just to kind of go through some of what that article is going to touch on, there's four main type of topics. The reference case includes affordable clean energy rule, which was passed by EPA or issued by EPA in June of 2019, and it issued guidance for states developing plans to limit carbon dioxide emissions for their coal electric power plants. So as a sensitivity case in this issues and focus, we're having a no ACE case, which assumes that existing power plants, coal power plants, regardless of efficiencies, will continue to operate as long as it's economic. We also have a carbon-free generation standards case as a part of this alternative policies, issues, and focus. The carbon-free generation standard case assumes that all 50 states achieve at least 50% generation by 2050 using a suite of generation technologies that emit little to no carbon dioxide emissions. Additionally, in this alternative policies case, we have the utility rate structure case. Currently in our reference case, residential end users who sell electricity back to the grid are compensated by the retail electricity rate. So what this case does is it examines the results and effects if they're compensated at either a wholesale or a marginal electricity generation rate. Lastly, in terms of our alternate policies case, we have a case looking at three different carbon fees, starting in 2021, increasing at 5% real per year, starting at $15, $25, and $35. So all that information is coming out towards the beginning of March. And lastly, later in the year, we're going to be releasing a case that looks at, well, what does varying demand for U.S. LNG, how does that affect domestic energy markets? So that's kind of the coming attractions. And before we transition into the Q&A, I want to acknowledge the amount of effort it takes in pulling together all this analysis material. And I really want to thank the staff and others in EIA that contribute to this with their hard work and dedication. In particular, I want to acknowledge Terry Yen, who is the AO product lead, as well as an integration team lead, for all her help wrangling the analysis as well as the people. So, so we're doing a Q&A slightly a little bit different than we have in previous years. I was going to ask two of our office directors to come up on stage to field questions. We do have a lot of technical experts in the audience that can also help out if need be. So I'll introduce Jim Diefendorfer, who's a director of our Office of Electricity, Coal, and Renewables and Nuclear Analysis.
Coal,
Nuclear and Renewables Analysis, and John Staub, who's our director of the Office of Petroleum, Natural Gas, and Biofuels Analysis. So we're very happy to take any questions you may have. I think there's a floating mic out there too, so if you raise your hand, somebody will.
You usually just have to stare at them for like 20 seconds.
Okay, I'm going to stare at one person in particular. Yes. I think you do need the mic because this is being recorded.
Hi, I was looking at, I think it was slide 11, where it had the low-cost renewables case as compared to the reference case. And there seems like this massive shift in renewable power generation in the low-cost scenario, but almost imperceptible changes in the other fuel mixes. And I was just trying to understand what's happening there. Are we just producing more power in the low-cost scenario? I mean, you could see modest shifts, but it doesn't look like anything like that line.
I believe with regard to my one, I believe with regard to the low-cost renewables, that I think that the level of demand is fairly consistent across the cases, but and that is, yeah, we do see a lot more generation from solar and wind as a result of the lower cost cases, and as Linda mentioned, by 2050, the cost of those technologies is 40% below what we see in the reference case.
The demand on electricity is in line.
Yeah, for the.
So we do see some tapering off, I think, in the coal generation as well as the nuclear generation. The natural gas generation kind of flattens out over time, but the solar and wind generation compensates for that. I think the level of demand is, I think, fairly consistent across those cases.
You're saying it adds up, even though it wasn't.
Yes. Yeah, I guess the other thing would be, I guess we have a generation, I think we have a generation graphic in the article itself that will give you a sense for how the various technologies contribute to the overall generation, and you'll see the overall generation levels being fairly consistent. So I think in the lower cost case, where in the reference case, right, currently, I guess in 2019, renewables make up about 19% of the generation. I believe in the reference case, by 2050, renewables contribute about 38% of the total generation mix. And I think in the low-cost renewables case, by 2050, we get up to about 50% of the generation mix.
I also have a question about the low renewables cost case. I think Linda mentioned that the overnight capital cost was 40% lower than the reference case. What was your rationale for coming up with that differential?
Well, I guess in terms of the model, it's 40% below the reference case level by 2050. So it starts out and then it gradually gets to that level. In terms of the application in the model itself, we applied a more aggressive learning rate to achieve that 40% reduction. So we're just trying to look for a reasonable. We're not necessarily saying that the costs are going to be at that level, but we're trying to establish a reasonable bound between that case and the reference case. And then the high cost renewables case, we're just assuming that the costs do not decline over time.
Terry. She has a microphone.
So I also believe part of your question was there any ulterior motive in choosing the 40% reduction? Meaning, was there something we knew or something we were promoting? And the answer is that, no, we don't advocate policy. We simply were providing you with a calculation that showed more accelerated cost reduction so that you could think about how that might use that data in your own analysis of investment or policy advocacy.
How does the reference case take into account the potential change? Does the reference case use the existing fuel economy standards, or are there any sensitivities around the proposals that the administration has put out? And are there any sensitivities around things like cost of electrification of transportation or anything like that?
So the reference case, as Linda mentioned, is using the current laws and regulations for transportation. Those fuel economy standards plateau effectively and don't increase any further. There's certainly discussions about whether to stop that requirement of increasing efficiency earlier, others maybe later, but that's not part of the reference case. The model and the analysis looks at, from an economic standpoint, competing electric vehicles and different types of electric vehicles, whether they're plug-in hybrid or straight electric vehicles. And there's growth, and that's what's, from an economic standpoint, that's what's represented in the reference case.
But no sensitivities around those uncertainty outcomes?
No, not in this AEO.
We have a question in the back corner. Oh.
I'm Joni Ochoa with S&P Global Platts. I had a question regarding your assumptions for nuclear power growth, and if you took into consideration subsequent license renewals for an additional 80 years, as well as small modular reactors and advanced reactors, and if you could comment on that.
Okay, with regard to the nuclear, we're not currently modeling small modular reactors at this point in time. We feel we don't really have a good basis for the cost estimates for those particular technologies. As far as the subsequent license renewal, we do take those into account. I guess basically the way we model the nuclear, in terms of we've accounted for any nuclear retirements that have been currently announced, and then we also incorporate the zero emission credit, the ZEC programs for the various states that have recently adopted those, and the balance of the fleet is maintained as long as it's economic to do so.
I think we have a chart in the AEO full publication that shows the amount of uprate or heat rate improvements.
Right. There would in the AEO in the AEO slide deck or in the AEO flip book, there will be some additional detail on nuclear additions and retirements over time, as well as how the generation plays out over the course of the projection.
Hey, thank you for coming today and explaining all of this. I'm wondering how you might have incorporated energy storage into any of your modeling and your outlook, especially around renewables, because that can change, the equation and the availability of them to provide power to the electricity markets and change their financial outlook.
So we are modeling an energy storage technology as part of this AEO. It's a 4-hour battery storage technology is what we're modeling. As part of the input for this particular AEO, we engaged a consultant in performing a study for us to develop new capital cost and operating cost assumptions, and then so the new energy storage assumptions are incorporated into this particular AEO.
You also said that the greatest increase of LNG export will take place, and I was just wondering whether you have taken the global demand or global markets into consideration on that, or and if so, which are your sources or your reference for that?
So in the AEO, we look at the prices for LNG in Europe and Asia, as those are kind of two main nodes within the analysis. The draw for LNG globally is something that there's a lot of uncertainty around the market at this point. One of the challenges right now that we have, just for, as you're thinking about it, is that last winter was a relatively warm winter. We're again in another fairly warm winter, and so demand for LNG in Asia is lower than it might be in a normal weather period, and so prices are quite low for LNG in the very short term. That shouldn't color your thoughts in terms of like what, from a long run, normal weather type environment, what the LNG demands might be. So that's, in our international energy outlook, we model demand for natural gas. This past year we incorporated a new electricity model that represents the competition between natural gas as well as renewables and coal, et cetera. And that then forms the basis for what goes into the annual energy outlook.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Were there any changes to light-duty vehicle, the way we model light-duty vehicles? I know there's some changes last year, thinking specifically maybe about the vehicle miles traveled or the car-truck mix. AO 19 had a very significant shift back to cars with the crossover SUV classification.
So yeah, I'm going to actually toss this to John Maples, who's our transportation team leader.
So for this year, there weren't a lot of big changes that occurred there. There was a change in policy, and that was the state requirements for the California ZEV mandates and the other states that have adopted. That didn't result in a big change in our projections of EV sales. So not a lot of change between our sales distributions last year and this year. And did you ask about BMT as well? So, yeah, so and that's very similar, growing about 2.4% per year total travel. Great.
Question over there.
Thank you. Tom Tiernan with the False Report. A question on oil and gas prices. I heard a Brent price in 2050 of 105 per barrel. I'm not sure what the natural gas equivalent was, if there was a Henry Hub price associated with that, but if there is any language in the AEO on if oil and gas prices separate, that gas is more of a global commodity separate from oil prices.
So oil prices are an input into the analysis. If you think about the oil price that's represented in the annual energy outlook, it's representing essentially the marginal barrel that's coming onto the market. That's essentially what Brent or WTI represent, with differences related to transportation. We see over the long term global growth in demand for liquids, and thus a demand for pushes out the demand curve towards more expensive resources, and that is why the prices rise gradually over the long term in the annual energy outlook. Natural gas prices are modeled endogenously within the annual energy outlook's modeling framework, and as shown in our high and low supply cases, oil and gas supply cases, you can see how different the price for gas could be depending upon how large or how small the resources are, or the rate of technology improvement. In the reference case, prices for natural gas at Henry Hub are, I think they're $4 roughly.
Just under
$3.50 in the long term. Over the past several AEOs, as we've learned more about the resource and how industry is able to produce natural gas, the resource size has increased. This year, our total technically recoverable resources have increased by about 400 TCF. So last year they were about 2,400 TCF, and now they're 2,800 TCF, and that can be found in our assumptions report. And that's for dry natural gas. It's not including the gas plant liquids.
Here, I think somebody's coming to your left.
Thank you very much. And I'm also the Japan Oil and Gas and Metal National Corporation. And so my question is regarding the renewable electricity supply. So I'm wondering the increasing the renewable electricity supply is increasing and will influence the metal market, so especially the critical minerals market prices. And how so does your modeling framework count the critical mineral market, so the price situation changing in the near future?
So your question is related to, for example, lithium for batteries, or?
Yes, that's fine. And something so some of the rare earth prices also.
Right.
Broke the system.
Yeah, do we have a?
So in general, like with our natural gas market,
with respect to critical minerals that affect electric power, like lithium for batteries, or the rare earth magnets used in wind turbines, we don't explicitly have a model for that. We assume broad changes in cost of producing them, which generally decline as you get more experience building them. But we assume that the markets will figure out how to get around getting more lithium into the system.
And I guess one other point is with the high renewable cost case, that was developed in thinking about, well, what if the cost of these minerals are higher? So you have technology reducing the cost of parts of the system that's supplying the activity or the energy, but other parts are increasing, and so that balances out to a longer run, higher cost.
I think there was a question over there.
Thanks. In the low-cost renewables scenario, I'm wondering how electric transmission is treated in that scenario. Is there any conclusions we can draw about significantly more transmission that gets built during that scenario?
Well, I guess in terms of the transmission, we model transmission between the various electricity market regions, and I guess for wind projects in particular, there are typically costs to interconnect those projects to the grid, and sometimes they involve, depending upon where the project goes into service, it may involve some longer distance transmission to interconnect with the grid. Of course, the solar PV projects can be sited pretty much universally across the grid, and there's less transmission involved with those particular projects.
So, we have another question?
We're out of time.
All right, I think this may be our last question, so you've snuck in under the wire.
Sorry, good too. I wanted to ask about low carbon liquid fuels outlook. I don't think I saw any reference to that in here, and I'm wondering if that implies that they are not a significant source in your outlook, notwithstanding like the LCFS in California and other mandates coming online. What's sort of the overall impact of various alternative liquid fuels?
So in our tables in the AEO, we have details on ethanol, biodiesel, et cetera. And when we show demand for liquids, that includes those bio-based, low-carbon liquid fuels. So it's incorporated in there. It's not explicitly broken out in these graphs here.
Okay, well, thank you all very much for a lot of really great questions.
I will reiterate the appreciation to the administrator and her team. I hope folks get a couple days off. I think everyone in this room actually probably does appreciate the intense amount of work that it takes to put something like this together. And so, public service is rarely appreciated these days, but at least here at the Bipartisan Policy Center for 90 minutes, we'd like to thank you for all your hard work. We now are going to switch over to a panel, so if I can have our three panelists join me, and I guess I will change mic technology. So we are now going to ambitiously seek some expert commentary on information that was just presented in real time, which means we have a panel that is not only highly skilled and experienced, but also quite nimble in their abilities.
We hope.
I'm going to offer some quick introductions. I think you all have access to bios, and then we will dive right in. So to my immediate left is Marie Jordan, who is the president and CEO of Peak Reliability, which has played a really central role in ensuring reliable bulk power across 14 western states. Marie has 30 years of experience in electric and gas transmission and distribution. Much of that served at the PG&E, and before that at National Grid. So you got both sides of the country we can count on you for. Next is Charles Rossman, who is the managing forecasting, model development, and resource planning for the Southern Company. So this is a really exciting day for you, Charles. I mean, this is pretty much like your Super Bowl when AEO comes out, so we appreciate you taking time. Charles has been with Southern Company since 1998. As I think most people know, Southern Company is the second largest power producer and distributor in terms of customer base. They are in active retail and wholesale markets, and also play a real interesting leadership role in infrastructure security and technology innovation. Charles' only task is to predict the future across Southern Company's evolving portfolio of nuclear, natural gas, coal, solar, CCS, and end-use efficiency. And so I'm sure the company appreciates that very much. Finally, Karen Hyde, who is the Vice President and Chief Risk Officer and Chief Audit Executive at Xcel. And I think that is a fabulous combination of duties that I'd love to understand a little more. Xcel is a major electric and natural gas delivery company serving customers mostly in cold places: Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Colorado, and then Texas and New Mexico. So you have a little versatility there. Karen also has 30 years of experience in strategic planning, risk assessment, negotiation, and communication. She began her career as a nuclear engineer with the Navy, which is a nice expression of global risk assessment. And so we will try to bring some of those larger reflections to bear. I want to try to split this up into basically three sections. I want to talk a little bit about generation, kind of anchored in the reference case. Talk a little bit about grid reliability. And then, free ourselves from the gravitational pull of the status quo and imagine a government capable of developing broad-based and durable public policy, and think about how that policy could actually influence the trajectory of our reliability, economy, and climate sustainability. So let's just roll in, and we'll just do kind of down the line initial question. Power generation changing a lot in a reasonably static policy environment. Customer choice, economics are driving those changes. Just reflect a little bit on the reference case, which basically had a pretty flat future under current policy. Does that match your imagination? Do you think absent some significant policy changes, we're going to basically see things calibrate out to a reasonably slow growth in renewables? How does that match what you've seen happening in the West?
Well, in the West, I think the growth of renewables has been high, mainly because of some large sources in the California area, Arizona, even Colorado really picking up in the wind area. So we've seen more significant change in our renewable portfolio in the West, which I think adds some unique challenges with the way we're constructed, the way we work, and the lack of a large organized market. Mm-hmm. So it's a little bit more of the Wild West.
Yes. And Charles, as you make projections about Southern's evolving portfolio, where do you see things moving without a significant policy change?
Yeah, so thanks very much for the question, Jason. Also, thank you to Administrator Capuano and EIA for putting together the AEO. It's a very important touchstone for many conversations, both within the company and across the community. And thank you to Bipartisan Policy Center for hosting the energy nerd community here for an important conversation. This is a great venue.
Next to Infrastructure Week, this is the geekiest moment of our annual calendar.
Yeah, that's what we're here for. So thank you. Yeah, the big changes over the past decade or so for Southern Company have been a great increase in the role that natural gas plays, and now for the past several years and continuing on, an increase in the role that renewables, especially solar, plays in our projection. And we expect both of those to continue, that the low prices of natural gas are completely consistent with using a lot more of it and using less of other things. Also, Southern Company has 2 nuclear units under construction. We expect those to come online, and so the role of nuclear in the fleet should continue. And so at least for us, we see a robust growth in a set of different technologies, especially low carbon technologies, as we move forward.
So Karen, I think we're going to talk a lot about Xcel's and Southern's bold commitments to the future, which require a lot of activity. But what do you see happening in the near term if policy is reasonably static?
So we see that our policies are driven a lot by our communities and our states. And so federal policy seems to be less influential for us because we are well supported by those states and those communities. I would say relative to the reference case, I see the role of coal and nuclear pretty similar to the reference case. I see a lot more aggressive additions of renewable energy and a lot less natural gas generation over time. The way we use our natural gas generation will really change. We'll be starting them up and shutting them down and having them regulate a lot more. But I think their actual generation hours will go down as renewables pick up.
So I got a question I want to start with you, Charles. Is baseload dead? Or let me ask that slightly less offensively. Do you imagine Southern or other utilities making investments in baseload power going forward?
Well, yes. At least for us in the Southeast, the sun doesn't shine at night. And so the role that renewables, and that's the primary renewable that is appropriate for us. And certainly we have a large role for units that run 24/7 most of the year. And for us, that's nuke, gas, and some of our most efficient coal units. And we expect that to continue for quite a while. That's an important role that the generation that is constant and serves for a long time will play.
So if I can modify, thankfully you're not shutting any of those facilities down in the near term, but do you imagine building new? I mean, is there going to be a Vogtle 3, Vogtle 4, and Vogtle 5?
Well, there will be Vogtle 3 and Vogtle 4. Yeah. Right now, I don't imagine a Vogtle 5 for now, but that's a possibility. Increased nuclear is a low carbon technology, and it plays an important role.
Karen, the definition of baseload is changing, but how do you imagine, what's going to be the going forward portfolio of 24/7 power in your service area?
So we've committed to extend the life of our nuclear plants to 2040 at least, and keep those operating. But I think just like I described on our gas generation, you see a lot more need for flexibility in your baseload generation. We do use our nuclear units sometimes to control for wind, so we do that. We have reduced the minimum generation points for most of our coal units. We've made them more flexible relative to how quickly they can ramp up and ramp down. And I think those things are key to ensuring that those low-cost resources are around for longer, but we also, they can't just sit there 24 hours a day. We do need to move those around. and we will continue to push them on that role, which also improves their efficiency in some ways.
So Jen, let's talk a little about grid reliability, and then we're going to cycle back to some other policy. As you look at the base case, the reference case, do you see reliability challenges as we go along under the presumed kind of current trajectory?
Yes, I do. I think one of our challenges when we look at some of the significant transmission expansion that gets approved by FERC but never makes it through a state or local permitting process, we're challenging ourselves more and more. In the West, back to the uniqueness, having been in both the East and the West, trying to do the large transmission builds without the RTOs, without shared cost provisions and things like that, you end up in a very unique situation. A lot of unique schemes to try and address the intermittency. We've done that in the West with, more than 200 RAS schemes, which I affectionately refer to as an if-then-but statement in an Excel when you're trying to figure out how you're going to keep the lights on. So when I look at that, I think that's our biggest challenge. How do we build the transmission to create the diversity? Because just as we talked about Southern Company, you've got solar as your major load. What if you had a nice, healthy DC line coming in from the Midwest to augment wind? I think that's where the challenge gets. How do we bring all this on, have a transmission system robust enough to create diversity in your portfolio so you can take a cloudy day, so you can take that day that the wind stops blowing. My affiliation with National Grid, I watched the wind stop blowing maybe once on the North Sea, and boy, it was a challenge with the number of gigawatts of wind. We haven't really faced that because we haven't really had the transmission system that became so dependent on our Midwest wind. So it'll be interesting to see if we don't learn how to get the permitting at the state and local level to agree with the agreements at FERC. It's going to be a challenge to deal with the intermittency.
I'm glad you raised the permitting question. I think it's something that we focused on a lot in the NPC study. But I want to kind of pose this to the rest of the panel. The question we have is, does our regulatory system tolerate success? I think our permitting challenges right now are proxy battles about people seeing whether we're doing continuations of old energy versus new energy. But when we think about the trillions of dollars of transformation that would be necessary in the next 20 or 30 years, could you cite a small modular reactor in 25 years if the technology were there? Can you imagine significant siting of sequestration facilities? How do you see the capacity to have the real kind of significant changes move forward? And do you also see the permitting issue as a potential obstacle?
Well, we hope that there are small modular reactors in 25 years because I think that's going to be needed in order to meet the challenge here. I did want to bring up one thing about the transmission system and reliability from your previous point, and then I can get back to the permitting. So when you're on the East Coast, you go from city to suburb to city to suburb to city to suburb. In my service territory, which goes from the Canadian border down to the panhandle of Texas, you go city to suburb and rapidly get to
mountains and prairies.
Mountains and prairies. One time going to a wind ribbon cutting ceremony, I had one of my daughters with me, and we turned off the highway, and after about a half hour, she said, "Mom, are we ever going to see anything again?" And so there's long distances and long transmission lines needed. And what we're finding is that we are needing to support the transmission system with more reactive power in certain areas, and to be able to better control wind and curtail more exactly in ways to be cost effective. So we are seeing those challenges, and those bring permitting challenges themselves. But what we see a lot is that communities benefit from having a wind farm. These are rural communities that wouldn't otherwise have had that tax base. So they benefit from that, and they actually then sort of tolerate the transmission line to connect it. And so we see a lot of that. Where it gets hard is when you're trying to bring that transmission line into your core metro area, which is why you put the wind farm there, is to serve the load in your metro area. So that becomes then a challenge. And one of our commissioners said over time that we should be, kind of buying all the land out beyond the next ring of highway. And we're like, well, that's not going to probably be cost effective.
It's a rather desperate approach
will
to
you let me
siting,
earn
yeah.
on that?
Yeah.
Plan held for future use? So I think that we're going to continue to see those permitting problems. I think what we're hoping is that as being small modular units, we may see less reaction to those.
Charles, reliability or permitting in any mix?
Certainly reliability challenges and permitting challenges are part of running an effective electricity system. The keys to successfully addressing those concerns are solid planning, solid design, solid engineering, and a whole lot of conversation, as you mentioned, about community involvement. And the places where transmission and facilities have been placed are the ones that are of least concern, and as increasing numbers of facilities or transmission lines need to be placed, it gets more difficult. And so just means that the planning and outreach and engineering and design and conversations with regulatory authorities, both local and national, are really important.
So fair warning, I'm going to soon mention the words PURPA and MOPR. But in the build up to that, where you mentioned the challenges in the West. And so electrons move faster than even the best public servants. Reflect a little bit on why can't that region of the country find its way into a more managed arrangement. And then I want to kick it down the line with the question of, are RTOs up to the task? Just as you think about even on the East Coast where they are, in argument most functional, can they handle the obligations that we're now kind of imposing upon them? But maybe a little bit just on the West, like we've been talking about this for 20 years. How come the Western states can't figure this out?
Well, I think that energy crisis kind of burnt a deep, deep hole in the West. But if I look at some of the challenges we had, peak reliability managed 47 BAs up until the middle of December, and then that moved over to CalISO and SPP. When we managed all those BAs, there were a growing number of BAs coming in rather than the shrinking that we've seen across the U.S. And really it's around the ownership of assets. So many places are either net exporters or net importers. And getting to that single market, there was so many gives and takes. There were winners and losers across the board the way they were going in, mainly on the transmission system. If you think about it, there's the giant battery, not really a battery, but acts like a battery, which is the hydro in the Pacific Northwest. We're up there and we're keeping California happy. But back to electrons, not only do they move faster than public servants, they go the path of least resistance. They don't follow contracts. So you may have a contract selling energy across a transmission facility, but due to the light load on the eastern side of the western interconnection, so running through Idaho and those areas, you have smaller transmission lines, but a lot less load. So you've got energy running in a giant donut with a big center hole where there isn't much load. So back to our really long transmission lines, there are too many winners and losers. Up in the East, it was a lot easier. When people came together for a market, there weren't people giving up so much with their transmission lines. But also in the West, there's a lot of transmission that's not remunerated for the use of the electric system. So it's very complex, and I think it has to get solved, because as we move into more renewables and more intermittent loads, and California continues to be a net importer, I think in the last report it was about 90 million megawatt hours a year, the largest state importer. Something's got to change if we're really going to make renewables and intermittent services work.
So Charles and Karen, having not warned you that we expect you to be FERC lawyers, you can take this where you want to go, but FERC is flexing in ways that I think we haven't really seen in a while. The minimum offer price rule, the MOPR, the efforts potentially to shift PURPA around through regulatory means are both imagined to diminish the market incentives for non-carbon generation. It's pretty esoteric stuff. And so my first question is, are those issues part of your planning horizon? I mean, as you think about the future, is that on your radar? And do you have a question, probably more of a MOPR and PURPA question, but how are you thinking about that, and are you thinking about that?
Honestly, it's not a very big part of what I plan to. There certainly are people in the company who are aggressively engaged in those issues, but for us, that has not been an important part of planning clean, reliable.
Based on the way you are organized, you are a little bit less FERC vulnerable, I guess someone might say.
That's right.
How's PURPA going?
I think the recent approval of our queue reform for transmission, for interconnection, has really helped because we had a lot of PURPA puts in the queue, and being able to manage that when you have projects that may or may not go forward based on state rules about how to buy from PURPA facilities. I think the queue reform's been really great, and it's been kind of transformative for us from FERC. So that's been a good thing. But I think we're going to continue to see, I would say, large companies wanting to develop large power projects under PURPA.
I want to talk a little corporate-led deep decarbonization, and then the questions of how that could impact reliability. Xcel and Southern have both, in a pretty bold way, indicated you're going to be changing your portfolios far beyond anything that EIA is arguing would be kind of naturally economic. I want to understand a little bit about what's driving that, and then ask if you both can kind of lay out where you see those challenges and what are the policy issues that are going to be important to that success. And so those are a lot of questions, but you can.
So we have a two-step vision. One is, the first step is 80% carbon reduction from 2005 levels by 2030. And we can get there with today's technology. And it actually saves our customers money. We have a strategy we call Steel for Fuel, which is we're building renewable energy and then retiring coal plants and reducing coal generation at other plants and natural gas generation. And our customers save money with that. The fuel savings are less than the cost to build the renewable resources. So we're seeing our fuel costs drive down, even as we build rate base a little bit. So I think that part's, we're going to hit that. And where we end up with that is about 60% renewables system-wide, about 15% each for coal and natural gas, and about 10% nuclear. And so that we can do. The next part of our vision is 100% carbon-free by 2050. And that's going to need some development of new generation types, specifically probably some sort of dispatchable carbon-free resource and some seasonal storage. One of the things that we see is if you try to go beyond, and I'd peg it at about 70% renewables, you start to see that you're curtailing all your additions above that, in large part because your storage gets full. I mean, you have sunny days all in a row or windy days, for a long time. So your storage gets full, and you've changed your load shape such by having those renewables that you really can't fully discharge your storage. So we need either new types of storage that have a longer window for discharge and more storage capacity, or something that will help us shift load between seasons. And so we are encouraging and looking at all the different alternatives that can help us meet that second stage, that 100% carbon-free by 2050. And I think energy efficiency, I didn't really hear that mentioned much. I saw it in the full document, but I think energy efficiency continues to be key to be able to meet our aggressive carbon goals.
I'm glad you brought that up. That is consistently the most important, least discussed aspect of the power system.
Right, and I think we see a lot lower load growth than was projected in the annual report. And in part, that's just because we think that there's more aggressive energy efficiency that's able to be deployed, and that those technologies will keep changing. I mean, anything you replace in your house today, you replace with something more efficient, dramatically more efficient than whatever you retired.
So before asking Charles, you do the same. Marie, would you like to manage that grid?
Well, you know, I will say some of the goals and targets in California have made some unique circumstances. And I'm going to step into some very controversial swampland.
No one's going to.
When a region that's interconnected as we are selects a high degree of renewables, they often in their portfolio will pay for renewables coming in. So EIM's a good example. We've got some beautiful renewables running in Idaho. California makes a call for renewables. They redirect those electrons, even though they're going to go the path of least resistance anyway. They'll redirect that energy source and fire up something that's not green. So as regionally we do this, sometimes it puts a heavier carbon footprint into an area that doesn't have those goals. So I think as we measure this, we have to be cautious with some of this, that we just aren't driving a different dynamic in the system. So really regional goals do make it, will be tough to run if the regulations really restrict it. But when I'm firing up a nice big coal-fired turbine or a gas turbine, my operators love it, but it's not really good for the whole. So how do you make these regional goals that you aren't using offsets? So how do you build transmission? How do you create the diversity within the renewable network without backfilling it with non-renewable in another region? So that's a big swamp.
My conclusion is that like states are just a hassle. That if we could just have a more federalist central planning, we'd be able to do this much better.
Federal policies would make it much more cohesive, especially in the control room.
Come back to that. So, Charles, Southern companies also made pretty bold commitment to a deep decarbonization. I think it's no or low, or low or no, I guess is the kind of way that I've heard Tom Fanning describe it in the past. That must have put a little bit of pressure on your planning system. How have you been part of that discussion, and where do you see it going?
Yeah, so the Southern Company goal similarly has two parts. The long-term goal, 2050 low to no greenhouse gas emissions, 2030 target, 50% below 2007 levels, and a similar response on it's likely a path that we can straightforwardly see to the 2030 goal. As I mentioned earlier, increased use of natural gas in place of coal, increased role of nuclear, and increased role of solar especially. Expecting natural gas prices to remain low, and technological improvements in solar and getting Vogtle 3 and 4 online will be our path to achieving that. Beyond that, the answer is similar on it probably requires new technologies that we aren't currently employing. If storage, especially if battery storage is likely to be an important part of that, there probably need to be some important material breakthroughs in storage technologies in order to make that become an important part of things. But we also are heavily involved in development of Generation 4 nuclear, so that's all right. What comes next after the technologies that we're building at Vogtle 3 and 4? And so have a robust engineering research project there, and other technological improvements are likely to be needed. And so our way to get there is a focus on a pretty robust R&D program, pretty robust program in engineering and design and planning. But it relies on things we don't currently know how to do well, but intend to get there.
So one follow-up question, which is a technology which I wouldn't put in either the existing or the breakthrough category, which is offshore wind.
Yeah.
So, rural Georgia, Mississippi, not the windiest place, but a lot of the states you serve have coastlines. Why is that technology not moving forward in the U.S.? Do you have any sense that could play a role in the Southern portfolio?
It could. It's right now simply not in the money. It's a bit more expensive than our other approaches. We certainly pay attention to it, and it could at some point become an important technology. And certainly the wind maps demonstrate that offshore wind is an important part of the resource in the Southeast, whereas, as you say, onshore wind is not.
So I have one more question, then we're going to open it up. And it's going back to this question of kind of federal versus state. And I realize that I have a meeting at NGA coming up. So I want to just say for the record, I think states are exceptionally important laboratories of democracy. They have been the core to our nation's stability. And so I love them very much. But getting back to the question of how we have massive domestic decarbonization, there's some discussion now about a federal clean energy standard. Of all the ideas in Congress that are significant and potentially viable over the next 5 years, that's probably the issue that's getting the most attention right now. There's some pretty good bipartisan discussions around that. And they seek to kind of achieve two things. One is to broaden the definition away from just renewables to a kind of non-carbon definition. So I want to ask how you think about that. And then the second is the premise that you'd have some national consistency. Not that every state would be exactly the same, but maybe you'd have kind of a currency of clean that could move across state boundaries. Would that be a good idea? Do you see that as a good focus for a federal conversation?
Well, I have 8 states, and they're all different. They all have different opinions about how to move forward. I think that, in the past we've supported federal action, but there's a lot of things that it needs to do. I mean, it needs to recognize early action. It needs to be fair among the states. In the last round, we saw that maybe it wasn't as equal across our states. That states who had taken early action ended up having to do even more action than states who had not taken early action. And so I think we need to kind of make sure, kind of to that Western thought is that it's fair for everybody.
Cheryl, you've been putting that into your planning at all?
Certainly important to be involved in conversations of all carbon policies, and there's a full, a wide range of things that are being talked about, and being involved in each of them is important, and they could be an important part of path going forward, and the conversations that you mentioned seem like the more constructive.
And Maria, the last question, and I'll frame this as my partner in the pursuit of authoritarian federal power. Could you imagine 80% to 100% decarbonization, not just with these two companies, but across the entire country with our current grid structure? Do you think, is that possible?
Well, the big piece is if you step away from the word renewables and you get to the zero carbon, I think you can get there a whole lot faster. I mean, you think about the nuclear plants, you think about large hydro, which a lot of states don't count in the renewables, up in that hydro-rich region, and looking at how much we can import from Canada through some of the existing lines. I mean, there's a nice healthy DC line on the East Coast already coming in from Hydro One. How do we utilize those and count them into the zero carbon? I think it's a lot more doable when you step away from just the renewable terminology, because I love a good spinning turbine. You get the inertia on the system, and that's an important component that I think gets lost sometimes in the conversation when you get into the politics state by state.
I'd love a good spinning turbine. Would be a nice T-shirt. We might try to. So as we transition to questions, I just want to note that the conversation we've had really underscores the importance of these alternative scenarios that EIA is going to be working on for March, and I think that's something really important that the administrator and just kind of laid out as just kind of normal business operations, but it is a really significant and almost courageous step for EIA to continue to fulfill its obligation to provide the story about what's happening right now, but enable and inform this larger and very dynamic conversation. So we may ask you to come back here in the spring to continue the discussion. So we do have our fleet-footed mic runners. We have time for 3 to 15 questions, depending on enthusiasm. I could threaten you that I have many more questions. Here we are.
Forgive me for not having read
And
your...
please introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Thad Hudeman. I'm sneaking in an EIA question since no one had the first question. Sorry. Forgive me for not having read your IRPs and knowing exactly, but in your phased decarbonization plans, do you have a target price of CO2 in dollars per ton that gets you on the path or triggers that kind of, those kinds of reductions?
No, we actually end up, we do scenarios that have different carbon prices, but as I mentioned, we actually, with this Steel for Fuel strategy, we end up saving money for our customers just outright without carbon. And part of that is because if you were to look at a wind map, and my 8 states were really dark, we have a lot of wind. And so we're able to get wind prices that are quite attractive. So in our plan, we would build mostly wind now, and then we'll phase to solar, just as your reference case showed. And within that 10-year period to 2030, we're able to accomplish that very cost effectively.
But not the tail end. The tail end doesn't have a CO2 price.
The tail end will need, we need technology for the tail end. And we're very hopeful. We're working on it. I think about it all the time.
Yeah. So our IRPs do involve having different CO2 price trajectories as part of side cases, so as part of the scenarios that we assemble. And that does help us see the role that different technologies can play in achieving greenhouse gas emission reductions. They have not been designed to achieve the low to no necessarily, but they are price paths that we think are reasonable views of what can come forward.
Tell us what those might look like, Charles. I'm just curious.
Yes. So in recent IRPs, we have used, in fact, for the past several, we have used $0, $10, and $20 CO2 price paths that increase at a rate above inflation as our CO2 cases.
And I would just say one other thing is that probably the more sensitive thing in your resource plan is the price of natural gas. So if you have a high natural gas projection, you'll show renewables to be more cost effective. Lower natural gas projection will show them to be slightly less cost effective. So I think, and when you compound all those years, that becomes a really big driver in a resource plan.
I was counting on you to use our gas price forecast.
Other questions? I will note that our EIA crowd is still stacked here in the front row, so if anyone has on their phone been reading the report, you can offer follow-up questions to them as well.
Yeah, hi. Just recently, the MPC has published a report on carbon capture and storage. Prices in there range more in the range of $90 to $100 per ton for CO2 sequestered. You mentioned a much lower figure just now. Where do you see that the difference in pricing would come from, assuming that those schemes will be implemented?
I'm sorry, ask the question again.
I can repeat it. So the recent MPC carbon capture utilization and storage study has a price of about $90 a ton to make that technology economic. And the gentleman says we've seen some discussion of some possibly lower prices. Why would there be that delta?
Yeah, so I didn't mention earlier, and that's probably a mistake, mentioned that we certainly have a research program engaged in carbon capture and sequestration. The sequestration resource in the Southeast, especially in Alabama, is actually pretty good. The National Carbon Capture Center is a funded research center in Alabama, and so we pay a lot of attention to this. I don't know that, there's a lot of development that still has to take place on capture technologies and ingestion technologies and all that. I don't have any reason to doubt the NPC estimates. It's expensive. It could come in at a lower cost than that, especially in some areas. Please.
So as a lot of these regions move towards higher and higher penetrations of both renewables and nuclear and batteries and other things that essentially have no marginal cost to dispatch, most markets in California and the Northeast and the Midwest are relying on marginal prices to make the whole system work. What needs to change, or does anything need to change in these markets in order for them to function as Excel and other people meet their goals of 80 or 100% carbon-free generation?
So we are in markets in MISO and SPP, and I know we talked about the West being sort of no man's land for a market. But we do try to cobble things together. So we do some joint dispatch with some of our neighboring utilities in order to try to bring some of those economics in there. I think that the signals to make sure that we keep a reliable grid are going to revolve around how you count the capacity of resources that you add, how you hold reserves and requirements for reserves, and capacity markets, so that we'll have those sorts of signals in order to continue to ensure that we have the right reliability. And so I think those price signals will become really important.
I think there's an important correction I need to make too. California does have a robust market. You have joint dispatch. You have some great bilateral contracts. What we just don't do is run that giant interconnection between the different BAs effectively as one large market with a day-ahead plan and other ways to really use those resources into the market. So just for clarification, I'm not discounting California's market. I'd hate that to end up in the press.
We've already tweeted it out.
Even the SPP and MISO, in order to send the right signals, do need to deal with capacity in a different way, and with credits.
So I have one more question, which I will ask slowly. Does someone else in the audience have a follow-up? Yes, sir, on the side here.
Just a geeky sort of question about the load forecast for EIA, whether there's temperature normal consideration or changes that drive changes in load over this long time period.
I think we refer that to our second row. They're all pointing at each other. There we go.
So what we use is a trend based on the past 30 years of history to build out our what we call degree days into the future. We get those historical degree days from the NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Organization. In addition to that, we include, these are population weighted, so we include population projections, and we find that movements of population have as much to do with changes in the load as any actual change in the weather would be.
So my final question is that we've heard a lot of people talking about net zero by 2050. And we think the letters NET are really important in that concept. There's been quite a bit of focus recently on carbon removal, whether it's through intense farm and forest projects or direct air capture. When you think about that last little slice of the pie, that last margin, does carbon removal fit into your imagination, or is that outside the scope of what you've been? I mean, Microsoft just announced they were going to be carbon negative, which I assume means they have some ambition for carbon removal, not like going back in time. How do you think about that?
I guess I think about the pie has to get bigger, so whether it's that we electrify transportation in a more aggressive way, or maybe I've seen, there's been a lot of discussion even more recently around electrifying natural gas end uses. So I think we have to sort of think bigger than just the current electric system in order to think of how we're going to solve the overall, reach overall goals. And so I think that is going to be a key to it. I think that at the prices mentioned on carbon capture, that's probably not going to be cost effective right now, but I hope that technology reduces those costs. I have great hopes for your carbon research. So that we can bring in those additional technologies.
Well, you want to reflect on that last kind of what's the scope of the challenge and what's going to ultimately matter?
Yeah. So our goal is clean, safe, reliable, affordable electricity for the benefit of our customers. And certainly, if there are certainly offset projects that are cost-effective and reliable, they certainly can be part of that. The way we have stated our goal as low to no certainly includes no, which is not necessary, which isn't even net no, it's no. And so that's a possibility. We're not sure what all is meant by the net part of it, and you asked the right question about offsets and offsets playing a role. Certainly they can, and don't discount that possibility.
Final comment?
Well, when you look at so many uses of natural gas in the home, and how do we do the electrification and the electrification of vehicles and things like that, I think there are certain areas that can really do a significant shift in how they change out what's being used in homes today. I know Berkeley, California had a very bold move that every new home that comes in, you cannot have a gas hookup. So I'm sure that wasn't planned for the financial projections of PG&E to have this swirl start going of really moving away from natural gas, especially with the low cost of natural gas. But I do think there's a huge opportunity that we need to explore on how do we do more electrification in the homes, and how do we move away from some of the carbon that's created already today by alternative fuel sources. But at the same time, how do we plan for that projection? I mean, if a home brings home a brand new Tesla, it's like a brand new home got built based on load. And so when you bring that into your garage, you now have two homes on one parcel. And in the density areas where we're bringing in a lot more electric vehicles, what's the impact to the infrastructure? So it's, there's always a balance to the question, but I think it's a great question to ask. What are you considering net?
So I want to thank the panel for elaborating on EIA's presentation and, frankly, just making the demonstration real time that having data enables one to sound really smart when making projections. And so welcome you all to hang out a little while, talk to our panelists, and thank you again for coming.